Welcome to On Defense and Security, a podcast that examines domestic and international defense and military affairs. Through conversations, we will bridge the gap between academic research and policy and provide a platform for informed discussions, enabling our listeners to better understand critical issues.
Welcome, everyone, to the On Defense and Security podcast run by the Center for International and Defense Policy at Queen's University. Joined today by Mark Kersten, who's an assistant professor in criminology in the Criminology and Criminal Justice Department at the University of the Fraser Valley in British Columbia. He's also a senior consultant at the Wayamo Foundation in Berlin, Germany. He comes to us with a basket of degrees. He has a law degree from McGill University in 2022 and a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics. He's the author of numerous articles and a book called Justice in Conflict. He runs a blog by the same name, which you can look up. From 2023 to 2024, he worked as a legal researcher for the Office of the Independent Special Interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with the Indian residential schools. He works primarily in international criminal law and human rights, and today we'll be talking mostly about the G word, genocide. Welcome, Mark. How are things going?
Yeah, good. Thanks. Thanks for having me. It's great to be on this podcast, and in particular, great to be on it with you.
Great. I think maybe we'll start with something quite simple. What is genocide? What is the kind of legal definition of that look like? And maybe also, how does it differentiate itself from other kinds of mass violence like ethnic cleansing or war crimes or crimes against humanity?
Yeah, so there is some debate around the particular definition. I'm sure we'll get into that, that emerged out of a particular political moment with particular political actors, right? So genocide as a term stems from really the work of one person, Raphael Lemkin, and then states and their interpretation of what they would allow the definition of genocide to be. And as we are sitting here right now, the legal definition under the Genocide Convention is any of the following five acts when committed with the intent to destroy a particular group, so think of a national, ethnic, or religious, etc. group in whole, so the entirety of the group, or in part, so part of the group. But there has to be an intent to destroy that group in whole or in part. And the five acts are killing members of that group, so murder, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of that group with the intent to destroy part of that group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of that group. Think about the types of conditions that people can live under where actually they can't fully live or they
Right.
will die slowly. So a very apt example of this would be starvation, not ensuring that insufficient amount of nutrition is available to people. But there can be other types of conditions under which people are placed that basically make it impossible to live. Fourthly, measures intended to prevent births within the group. So basically, if you think about ways to destroy a group, one way, of course, is to destroy its ability to continue being a group through the natural process of births, right? So here things can include and have included previously rape and sexual violence intended to change the genetic composition of a group, but it may also be things like enforced sterilization of women in the group. And then finally, forcibly transferring children of that group to another group. And here, this basically means kidnapping or taking children of a particular group and then moving them to another group. And there are lots of good examples of this, unfortunately, but two that stand out right now are, of course, the way in which Indigenous children in Canada were removed from their homes and transferred to through kind of adoption services to white families, right? And these indigenous children were again transferred from indigenous communities to non-indigenous families. People have argued, I think, quite persuasively that that can amount to an act of genocide. And in Ukraine, many children, in particular children who were living in orphanages in the areas that Russia invaded in 2014 and 2022 were taken by Russian officials and then transferred through adoption agencies to Russian families. And that also has been credibly argued, in my view at least, that it could amount to that final act of genocide. So it's those five acts when committed with the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. Now, those acts are brutal in their own right,
Yeah.
and they may not always amount to genocide because they may be committed, the acts may be committed by governments, militaries, entities that want to commit those acts, but don't want to commit those acts in order to destroy the group.
Mm.
So these criminal acts, can overlap with the other types of atrocities that you've described. So murder can also be a crime against humanity under international criminal law and can obviously also be a war crime. Forcibly transferring children, the forcible transfer of any group of people can amount to a war crime and a crime against humanity. And here, for example, it's notable that at the International Criminal Court, an institution that was created, including with the help of the Canadian government, to investigate and prosecute international crimes like war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, etc., has actually issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin and one other Russian individual who's in charge of the transferring of these Ukrainian children from Ukrainian territory into the homes of Russian families. And the ICC has charged both Putin and this commissioner, Maria Lvova-Belova, with war crimes
So,
because the transfer of those children is a war crime. But if they also find that there's intent to destroy the Ukrainian population as such through the abduction of these children, then it could also amount to genocide. So these crimes interact and overlap and relate to each other in really important ways. What distinguishes genocide is not the act, but the intent behind any of these acts. And if the intent is missing, it may still amount to a crime against humanity or a war crime. And finally, ethnic cleansing for it's a whole other story, but ethnic cleansing is not currently recognized as an international crime,
Mm.
but should be understood as kind of a conglomeration of international crimes. So ethnic cleansing typically refers to the effort by, again, a state or some kind of actor to remove members of a particular group from a particular territory, to cleanse that territory of that group. That requires force, various types of coercion, and typically would necessitate things like the forcible displacement of that population. Those things can amount to war crimes, can amount to crimes against humanity. And if ethnic cleansing, if the effort to cleanse a particular area is done in order to not only remove that population from that territory, but also to destroy that population. Think of the Armenians removed from the Ottoman Empire. Think of what Palestinians claim in relation, and many others claim in relation to the removal of Palestinians from their territory, that there's this additional element that there is an attempt to destroy them as an entity as such. And so ethnic cleansing can also very much, and forcible displacement can very much touch on genocide.
Is it accurate to think of all these other categories as kind of nested within genocide, or is it, or they're all kind of separate legal structures that interact quite independently?
It's such a great question because on the one hand, they are separate, and the legal analysis that's required to demonstrate that something is a war crime is very different from the legal analysis required to show that something is a crime against humanity, and is very different from the analysis required to show that an act was done intention with genocidal intention.
Right.
And so I want to say that they are separate. But whenever I teach this, and I know others who teach this to students, somebody will say, well, why don't you just go for the crime against humanity? Or why don't you just go for the war crime? And sometimes there's this sense, and it's incorrect, that there's a hierarchy of international crimes with genocide at the top. And that's not true. States have never articulated a vision of international law that suggested that war crimes are worse or less bad than crimes against humanity, and that crimes against humanity are somehow less bad or worse than genocide. They just did not articulate this, and quite rightfully so. And I think that while the narrow legal way to prove these crimes requires that someone take seriously all of the legal steps that you have to take to prove that a war crime or an act of genocide or a crime against humanity has taken place, in fact, in reality, it's much more blurry and these things overlap and interact, and the same act or the same series of acts may be all three at the same time. And so there's a difference in understanding these things through that narrow legal scope required to, convince a judge that one of these international crimes has occurred versus reality where, people don't commit crimes against humanity thinking, I'm only going to commit crimes against humanity and
Right.
I'll stop at war crimes, right? Like this is not how
Right.
any of this op works in reality. These interact and relate to each other.
I want to ask about this question of intent because obviously especially when we're talking now about Gaza and Israel, this word intent comes up constantly, and
Yeah, of course.
a lot of the Israeli organizations or pro-Israeli organizations are talking about, yes, there's a lot of death, but Israel's not intending to carry out a genocide. I'm curious how intent plays out in these conversations in comparative cases. Like how has intent been proven in court or in previous instances, and how does that compare to how it's playing out now, when like Israeli supporters kind of make that claim?
Yeah, so the gold standard for intent is a
Yeah.
document that says we are instituting a plan and a policy to destroy a group.
Hey.
And genocide scholarship, and indeed wider public knowledge of genocide, is of course very much shaped by the Holocaust paradigm.
Yeah.
And one of the rather unique things about the Holocaust is that you do have the smoking gun. You do have the Wannsee Conference
Mhm.
where the Nazi leadership got together and basically said, look, what we have tried to do in terms of ethnic cleansing and brutalization of Jewish people in Europe hasn't worked. And so we need to adopt something that seeks to exterminate them, not just move them to Russia and further to Madagascar or whatever, but actually to exterminate them. And from that, you get the final solution. And so there you have unambiguous intent.
Mhm.
In other instances, you won't have that. You will not have a top senior level conference where it'll be articulated, hey, here is our genocidal intent. Instead, you have to start piecing things together. If you think of, for example, the Rwandan genocide, you do have senior officials basically speaking on radio, articulating genocidal logic and inciting people to commit genocide. And then you have 800,000 people listening to these messages and taking these political messages and actually doing the work of the genocidal slaughter. And so courts were able to piece all of this together and say, we may not have a document or a conference, but we have leaders instructing people with genocidal logic, right? Think of the kind of dehumanization we hear. So whenever anybody starts referring to members of another group as animals as opposed to humans, this is like a bell that should ring in all of our minds that, okay, there's a risk of genocide because dehumanization is absolutely critical to convincing regular people, otherwise regular people, to either commit genocide or to accept that it's occurring and not push back against it. So they would take these bits of rhetoric, the instructions from, political actors, political officials, and the actual acts on the ground, and it became, they made the case. And you see this in other contexts um, as well. You kind of try to take what the people in charge are saying and try to make the legal argument to say that that suffices to indicate that there is a level of intent that then is in, acted upon by your rank and file soldiers or your commanders, and indeed sometimes members of the public, right? So if you think about the claims being put forward at the International Court of Justice in relation to Gaza, that's exactly what not only the South African government and its lawyers did in bringing a case to the ICJ, but it's also basically what all of these human rights organizations and institutions, including Israeli and Palestinian human rights bodies, have shown, which is, look, you have the destruction of the group in whole or in part. That's clear, right? We're talking about tens of thousands of people killed. We're talking about all schools effectively destroyed, hospitals effectively destroyed. Very few are still operational. You have intentional starvation. You have a bunch of acts that we already know can fit into the five genocidal acts. The only question is, does Israel, does its government have the intent in committing those acts to destroy the Palestinian people in Gaza in whole or in part? And again, it's a little bit like a puzzle, but what South Africa really has tried to do, and others have tried to do, and again, I think rather persuasively, is point to multiple, and we're talking about pages and pages of announcements by senior political officials, the president of Israel, cabinet ministers, etc., who invoke what we have always known as genocidal logic. And then sometimes people will say, well, yeah, but these cabinet ministers are idiots. They're not, they're right-wing fanatics. You can't listen to them. But that doesn't hold water. Look, if imagine Mark Carney had a couple of genocidal nutters in his cabinet, and they spoke openly about wanting to steal indigenous people's land and wanting to slaughter more indigenous people, etc. And we said, whoa, 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 you have genocidal people in your cabinet, and nothing happened to them for 3 years or 2 years or whatever it is. At what point do you say, actually, it's not an aberration that you have these people in cabinet. These people in cabinet are kept in cabinet and protected in cabinet because what they're saying is part of cabinet's policy. It is not separate from cabinet's policy. Because if it was separate from cabinet's policy, there would be some consequences for articulating this genocidal rhetoric. And so again, I think if you put all this together, ultimately you have to go to a judge, and that's the most important thing, right? We're talking about whether this or that is genocide. We can have opinions, but ultimately to convince a judge, you have to try to bring all of these pieces together and say, together this suggests that there's intent, or there is no plausible argument that exists other than to conclude that all of this together indicates some degree of genocidal intent. There's no feasible counterpoint. And we can go through the counterpoints that have been proposed, but they've been, I think, really dispelled. One, for example, is, hey, this is not genocide, it's war. The Rwandan genocide took place in what most people I think would recognize was a very fragile peace, but still an ongoing
Conflict.
armed conflict. We cannot forget that the Holocaust was perpetrated in the context of World War II. The genocide in Srebrenica occurred during an international armed conflict, or at least a civil war within the context of the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia. So this idea that genocide can't be committed because all of these acts are actually just the consequence of an armed conflict or war doesn't hold water. And that's really important. And dispelling these will be important. Dispelling these kind of misconceptions will be important for courts and for lawyers bringing forward these arguments. But I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, what about the argument, and I've heard this from supporters of Israel and the Israeli government, is that it's not necessarily just a war, but it's also a war against a active terrorist organization, which in itself has genocidal intent against the Jewish community. How does that play out, or how do you anticipate that will play out in the courts?
So that's, I mean, on the face of it, I I agree.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's pretty clear that Hamas has genocidal intent just from reading its documents and statements. Um, you know, yeah, I have no problem with accusations of genocidal intent with respect to Hamas. I believe Hamas is a genocidal entity. In fact, I would prefer that we understood it as a genocidal entity and treated it as such rather than terrorist entity because, you know, when we describe it only as a terrorist entity, then we're immediately or often immediately in the space of continuing war and justifying certain acts that actually violate international law. And when we
Mm.
think of it as a genocidal entity, it at least encourages some kind of legal thinking or what justice might look like for people who have been targeted by a genocidal group.
Mm.
Um, but of course, that being said, it would, it's implausible. It would be it well, it's just wrong to suggest that if one group or a state is threatened by a genocidal terrorist organization, that in return it is somehow given carte blanche to commit genocide against an entire civilian population in which that terrorist entity is embedded. And that's wrong for a number of reasons. For, I hope, obvious reasons, because this is true everywhere, including in domestic law. Like, if someone, you cannot, one crime, one criminal offense never justifies the commission of an additional criminal offense. We fortunately do not live in a world like that. And indeed, one of law's purposes is to prevent precisely that type of thinking, right? This eye for an eye thinking and to displace conflict from revenge to courtrooms or to legal argumentation. We can talk about how successful law is in doing that, but that's one of its theoretical reasons of existence. So, you know, there is an appropriate response. I think that the vast majority of international lawyers will say Israel was allowed to take in response to Hamas's terrorist attacks on October 7th and genocidal attacks on October 7th, but those did not include destroying every school and hospital in Gaza and then taking over more territory in the West Bank under the cover of what was happening in Gaza. And secondly, and almost, just as importantly, within the claim that, hey, what matters here is that Israel was targeted by a genocidal terrorist entity, and therefore what subsequently occurred in Gaza um, is is legal or legitimate, confuses, and I think this is in some ways the core problem of how Gaza is talked about, including in Canadian Parliament, is it conflates Palestinian people with Hamas. And when you start conflating the Palestinian people with Hamas, it is the rhetoric that justifies, at the very least, war crimes, because it legitimizes violence against civilians by claiming that they are, in fact, not civilians. They're, in fact, somehow complicit in Hamas's atrocities. And therefore, it gives carte blanche to destroy their schools, their hospitals, their roads, their community centers, etc. And I think in the last couple of years, that has been one of the most dangerous forms of argumentation that we have seen. This constant conflation that the people of Gaza um, are Hamas or in some way implicated in Hamas.
Or even
And
like
I just want to
preemptive.
note, yeah,
Yeah, sorry.
and the president, just one note on this, the president, Isaac Herzog, famously said, right at towards the beginning uh of this most recent form of conflict, that there are no innocents in Gaza,
Yeah.
right? Which again goes to this idea that they're legitimate targets, and they're just not. They're not.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say like I've heard a few times where it's like, today's children is tomorrow's Hamas members or tomorrow's terrorists, right? So it's like almost this inevitability of everyone in this area becoming eventual threats and terrorists, and therefore we're kind of preemptively taking them out. And I did want to ask about something that
Yeah.
comes up quite often in the public conversation around this is the cultural genocide part.
Yeah.
Because you said a bunch of times, destroying of a people in whole or in part, and in what leaders say, in Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide over the radio and things like that. But I think for people who kind of use words like genocide for particular conflicts, they're also talking about what governments do in the long term in terms of policy choices, right? And so you can think about kind of the segregation system that exists in the West Bank, or I've heard the members of the Tamil community talk about what happened in Sri Lanka in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s in terms of the language policy and the slow policies that through policy dehumanize a population, which then justifies or at least leads to eventual violence. And so, how does the legal system deal with not just what politicians say in the moment or genocidal logic, but actual logic built into the policies that are enacted over decades sometimes that um, if this kind of what you might call slow violence, right? Which is
Yeah.
like the kind of disintegration of the community and the inability of the community to maintain itself as a community. So if you say that you ban a community's language, or you say that they can't do something that's important for their cultural identity, it prohibits them from maintaining themselves as a community, even if you don't outright kill them. So I'm curious how this conversation of cultural genocide plays either legally or in the broader kind of academic discourse on
Such a
it.
good and important question. And there's a couple of things I think to unpack there. Um, but as a good starting point, I think for anyone who wants to kind of understand why what genocide was dreamt to be and then what it became, read Raphael Lemkin's
Lumpkin.
work on genocide,
And
and then either read the Genocide Convention and compare them, or if you have a lot of extra time, like I sometimes, or I have a lot of interest in this and study this, you can actually read what the delegations at the drafting of the Genocide Convention said and how they narrowed the scope of genocide. So, in a, in very broad terms, you can imagine that generally speaking, today we would consider genocide to be physical or biological destruction of a group. And therefore, we set aside cultural genocide. And as you rightly said, people have raised the question, well, if my language is taken away, if my religious or cosmological practices are prohibited under law, if I'm displaced from the lands to which I have a relationship that goes far beyond the idea of ownership and property. It's a
right.
spiritual, it's a profound connection. If all of that happens, I can no longer be the group that I was. I can't be the group. And therefore, the group has been destroyed in whole or in part, even though every single member of the group is still alive,
Right.
right? Why is it that that's not genocidal? And the bad news that I have is it's not genocidal currently under international law, and that's at least in significant part thanks to Canada.
Mm.
When Lemkin thought of genocide, he did include cultural genocide as a genocidal act. That he believed that if you destroyed the cultural foundations of a group and the group was no longer the group as it once was, there had been the commission of genocidal violence. When the Genocide Convention was being negotiated, Canada had a huge problem with the inclusion of cultural genocide. So they were debating the inclusion of it, right? It's not like no one ever talked about it. It
Yeah.
was there. And Canada, amongst others, basically said, look, we don't want this. We do not want this to be included in the Genocide Convention. Incidentally, one of Canada's worries wasn't the obvious one, Indigenous peoples, although I'm sure they were thinking about how they were committing cultural genocide through, for example, the prohibition on the potlatch and other types of, um, spiritual activities and traditions, etc. But they were actually worried about cultural genocide between Anglophone and Francophone Canadians.
Mm.
And they were worried about it. And so, and explicitly so. And so, in one of the most remarkable and I think saddest chapters of Canada's contributions to international law, Ottawa instructed its delegation at the Genocide Convention negotiations not just to push for the exclusion of cultural genocide from the convention, but actually instructed them to vote against the entirety of the Genocide Convention if cultural genocide was included.
Wow.
Yeah. And so we don't have good answers to the legal question of can we do something about this? Because the answer is under the Genocide Convention, no. Now, I am just finishing a paper that talks about this and what Canada owes to Indigenous people in particular for having whittled away international law and cultural genocide. For me, at least, that doesn't mean that the story ends there. There is nothing that would prevent Canada from criminalizing cultural genocide in the Canadian Criminal Code,
Mm.
right? It's not prohibited from doing that. It can do whatever it wants within its own criminal code. So maybe that's something to explore, but at least in international law, thanks to states like Canada, cultural genocide does not exist. But I think just one point I wanted to pick up on is the point that you made about slow violence, right? Pauline Wakeham, I think, came up with that term, and it's so important. And it's important because genocide is often waged not through mass murder and is often not evidenced by mass graves and piles of skulls and bodies, the kind of imagery we imagine when we talk about genocide as a result of the images of the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide. It's often conducted through indirect structural violence, starvation, imposing those conditions that basically may not make it so that you die tomorrow, but you won't live the next year or the next couple of years, right? And that is also destructive to the group. And slow violence captures this idea, which is so important, which is that, and rightfully so, international law is silent on the duration of genocide. Genocide does not have to be spectacular violence. It does not have to be bombs raining from the sky. It does not have to be mass graves and, huge piles of corpses. It does not have to be that. There's nothing in international law which suggests that it cannot be waged by indirect structural means like starvation or imposing certain kinds of conditions on people, like putting them in certain types of camps or denying them medicine or whatever it may be. That is so important for people to, I think, to realize again, because we get these misconceptions about what genocide is this almost momentary eruption of sadistic violence. And it's not, I would say that in many instances, it's just not like that. It wasn't like that in Canada. It wasn't like that. Um, in Armenia, where many people were obviously slaughtered eventually, but they were first displaced and forced to walk and died along these death marches, right? So there's all of these other ways in which actors can commit genocidal violence, and sometimes it can be over very long periods of time.
What happens when intent is explicit, but it's in the language of we want to save these people, right? If you think about the Indigenous community in Canada, it wasn't like we're going to destroy these people, but
Right.
we're bringing something good and amazing to
Right.
these quote unquote savages, and so the intent is almost has to be in hindsight retroactively read into the actions, but at the time their intent is quite different, if that makes sense. Like, does that matter, or is that
So I would make a distinction.
right?
The saving is the motivation and not the intent.
Okay.
So and I think that it's also a great question because international law on genocide does not care what your motivation is.
I see.
If
Okay.
if you want to destroy a group by hugging it so hard that you know, if that's your motivation to hug something, but you are also hugging it in order to destroy it,
Right.
you have an intent to destroy it. It's just that your motivation isn't immediate annihilation. And so we have to constantly distinguish between motivation and and intent, right? So a good example too is I mean I think the one that you raised is quite apt, right? This saving idea, saving, what we read in Duncan Campbell, in his work, the former the minister who was responsible for so many horrors in the residential school system, and John A. MacDonald, and so many others in the churches. They wanted to save Indigenous children. But it also seems clear that you can build a case that that may be their motivation, but they also sought to destroy
Mm.
the population, the indigenous population, by, for example, removing children and then having the 60s scoop and other forms of removal of the children and then their placement in Canadian families. And so they wanted to change the group and fundamentally destroy the group in part, right? But their motivation may have been,
Yeah, whatever it
basically
was, yeah.
Christian salvation or whatever. Here too, somebody might argue, look, Israel doesn't have the intent because it's motivated by protecting Israel. But again, we cannot conflate motivate you. Sure, maybe. Maybe some people think that, in the Israeli government, that this level of destruction of Gaza is required in order to protect Israel, right? And that is often the claim. But that doesn't mean that the intent doesn't exist to destroy that group in whole or in part. Because again, your motivation for destroying a group is different from your intent to destroy that group. And so we have to tease those out. And it's important that we do so, again, because when we don't, you know, very sophisticated people will pick up on it and try to confuse us as to how genocide law works. And, when I'm on Twitter or whatever it is, there are very smart people who opine on what genocide law is, who haven't read about the genocide. I don't know. I don't think they've often read the Genocide Convention. So I was talking to one not that long ago who said, but the Palestinian population in Israel is, within Israel is not being killed or destroyed. It's the destruction of the group in whole or in part. One part of the group may be completely fine. Part of the group may be growing in population. The Genocide Convention doesn't say everybody needs to be under attack in every corner of the world where this group exists. It's the group in whole or in part. So again, we even are talking now, like, I'm sure there are people who make the claim that there's genocide in the West Bank or that there's risk of genocide in the West Bank, but the arguments put forward at the International Court of Justice are only on Gaza because Palestinians live there, and that's genocide according to the South Africans and others in whole or in part.
This distinction between motivation and intent is quite important because I mean I've even heard saying what's happening in Gaza is designed to save the Palestinians from Hamas, right? And so it is like a collateral damage kind of argument where we have to go through this process in order to eventually, in essence, help the Palestinians. And so that separation I think is quite important. Um, in terms of the public, I mean, why do you think there's such a attachment to this word? It's such an explosive word whenever something is used, and it's not often used for most conflicts. It's some conflicts it doesn't get recognized very quickly. I remember people were activists in the Palestinian space were using the word genocide from about November, December 2023, and then that's just with this conflict, and then with previous conflicts long before that, pointing to laws and life in the West Bank, etc. But it seems to have caught on now in an interesting way, right? So how do you see this process bear where like it doesn't get widespread acceptance? It's actually criticized. You're yelled at and could lose your job and could get into trouble if you use the word, but then all of a sudden it becomes more accepted over time. Like how and why
Mhm.
does that progress happen with some of these conflicts?
I mean, it's a great question. I think it goes back to, I mean, I think there's a couple of things happening here. One is that in a large part of the public's mind, which of course includes people who are subjected to atrocious levels of violence, there is a hierarchy in international law and international politics that establishes that genocide is the crime of all crimes.
And
And so I think that sometimes creates an impetus in order to describe the violence occurring in whatever situation it is as being genocidal. But also, unlike other international crimes like crimes against humanity, the Genocide Convention requires, demands that states who have signed the Genocide Convention, which is basically all states, do something when there is genocide happening or when there's even a risk that genocide is happening. And so the Genocide Convention itself compels states to take action to prevent genocide. This is also often forgotten, and there are very few times that I wish that Twitter had more like um what's it called? More space or like more characters that we could write
right.
out because people use the short version of it, the Genocide Convention. But the name is the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. And that word prevention is so important here. It sure I hope it's obvious, but it would be absolutely ludicrous if states were only obligated to stop a genocide once it was halfway done. All that has to be established is a risk, a serious risk that it is going to be committed or it is being committed. And there you can point to, for example, if you're thinking about Gaza, you can say, look, there's really good evidence of war crimes. There's charges at the ICC on crimes against humanity. There's all of these things happening. And also, I want you to know that they are happening against a group of people. There is in history always a risk that that can turn genocidal. So even if I don't have a court that tells me it's genocide yet, the risk of genocide exists, and we need you to prevent it. We need the international community to do something to prevent it. The same thing, I think the same types of things we see in the context of Darfur, obviously early on in 2003, but also recently in what's happening in Al Fashir.
Yeah.
When you have a particular group of people, a group that are subject to a siege over a period of time, and then that entity, the Rapid Support Forces, enters that siege and starts executing. I mean, the word siege should already have red flags if it's around a group of people that share common characteristics. That should also already be a risk of genocide, right? Because just logic and history and what other genocides tell us. So I think there's an understanding that genocide captures the world's imagination as the worst crime, and then there's also a understanding that it comes with certain obligations to prevent it. Obviously, as we are sitting here, no one has done anything about what's happening Al Fasher. Canada can't even take seriously the last 10 years of reporting that we are sending arms to Darfur through the UAE and others, the United Arab Emirates, and no one did anything really to prevent genocide in Gaza. So in short, I think the hope is that by grasping onto the law and rhetoric of genocide, that more will be done to prevent it, but the record in actually doing that is pretty grim.
Hmm.
I don't know if that
Um,
answers it.
I have a few questions on like the mechanics of it, right? Like, let's say, thanks to NGOs, thanks to journalists on the ground, kind of evidence is starting to build up of some sort of genocidal logic and events happening on the ground. Pick whatever country.
Yeah.
What happens next? Like, who's responsible, or who has the power to move it to the next level in terms of international community, and after that happens, like, what happens next, and then what's the enforcement mechanism look like? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding amongst in the public about, you know, the word gets thrown around by not just lawyers, but by politicians, by media, by academics. But then, like, who's actually in charge of, or who has the power or resources to actually move any of that into whatever realm it needs to go?
And do something about
Do
it.
something. Yeah.
It's a really great question, and the International Court of Justice tried to answer this. So, if you think back on what I said, that the Genocide Convention creates a universal obligation on all states parties to the Genocide Convention, which is basically all states, to do something to stop genocide where there's a risk of genocide or it is actually being committed. So that obligation exists on all states. It is a very unique convention in this way. And then there's additional obligations that if people have committed or states have committed genocide, that they have to be punished. So all states have an obligation to actually punish, prosecute, we would say, investigate and prosecute people who have committed genocide. But let's go back to this universal, like it's in the Genocide Convention. There's a universal obligation on all states to do something to prevent and punish genocide. And it's a good question. Like, okay, well, NGOs will raise it or, raise the specter of genocide, or you and I will talk about something and say, look, this looks a lot like what a past genocide looked like, or we've got to do something about this because even if it turns out it isn't genocide, it
Yeah.
could turn into one, right? All of these things, right? And no one wants to wait for a court to tell us what to do, especially when even international courts are ignored. I think what's instructive here is what the International Court of Justice said. It basically said, look, if all of these states have obligations to prevent genocide, that obligation can't be felt equally, right? If you are, um,
What?
if you're in Namibia and there's a genocide happening, or you believe that there's a genocide happening in Myanmar, what can you do? Probably not that much. It's very unlikely that you have robust financial or economic relations, right? You may not be able to do very much. But if you are India or China, you do have robust relationships. And so what the ICJ said is basically that the thickness of your obligation depends on your relationship and proximity, political, economic, etc., proximity to the situation in which you believe that genocide may be at risk of being committed or is actually being committed. So how does that play out? Well, I mean, in a couple ways. One is that the Gambia, the tiny West African country of the Gambia, believed that genocide was happening in Myanmar. And it brought a case to the International Court of Justice against the Rohingya people. And it brought a case to the International Court of Justice over Myanmar's alleged violations of the Genocide Convention. And when it did so, it said, I am doing this, even though we're like poles apart and basically have no political relationship to each other. We are doing this because we have obligations under the Genocide Convention to do something where we believe there's a risk of genocide. And the way that we are demonstrating that obligation is by bringing a case to the International Court of Justice. When South Africa brought its case against Israel to the International Court of Justice over breaches of the Genocide Convention, it said the same. But its relationship with Israel is a whole other podcast, but is actually long-standing and quite robust and quite dramatic and controversial, um, including under the apartheid regime, right? The apartheid regime's relationship with Israel was quite something. But South Africa made the same claim that one of the ways in which we are demonstrating our obligations under the Genocide Convention is actually to bring this case forward. Now, not everybody can bring cases forward, but if you're thinking about like what could Canada do, well, when people talk about not sending military arms to Israel, or when people talk about suspending trade, the trade relationship with Israel, one of the things I think that they are trying to articulate, maybe not everybody, but some people are trying to articulate, is that would be in furtherance of the kinds of things that an individual state can do in response to either what the state believes is genocide or the distinct and serious risk that there is genocide happening. And what I think is instructive about these examples is that basically every state can do something
Mhm.
in order to demonstrate that obligation. Is it enough to save lives? Probably not, but maybe. And it's spelled out in that way in the Genocide Convention and through the International Court of Justice's rulings that basically all states can do something. It's just what they can do will depend on their proximity and political and economic relationship to the state that's committing the genocide. But in my head, there's probably always something that states can do. And a state like Canada in relation to Israel-Palestine has a lot more that it could do.
Whenever I talk about this stuff with students, one word they always come back with quite legitimately is enforcement, right? And so what happens, let's say, like how slow of a process are we talking about that it goes through the courts as bombs are falling? And then let's say some ruling comes down that says, stop everything that you're doing. What is the enforcement mechanism that's available internationally so that, Israel or the Myanmar government or whoever is kind of compelled to stop the killing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's a distinction to be made between binding and enforcing. So people will say, for example, that the recent International Court of Justice ruling that said Israel is under an obligation to allow UNRWA to provide aid to people in Gaza and to ensure that all other entities seeking to provide aid to Palestinians in Gaza are able to do so, that Palestinians can get aid. And um, and a lot of people will bring up that that is an advisory opinion and therefore isn't quote unquote binding. But that's not really true. It's just that the court can't create new obligations that are binding on Israel as a result of its judgment. So it can't be like, here's our judgment, and therefore, if you don't do this, you owe, I don't know, $1 billion or something, whatever. Yeah, we can't create new obligations. But the law on which they rest their decision to say you must allow sufficient aid to go in is binding on all states, and it's binding in this instance on Israel. So the law itself is binding. There's just no additional binding obligations that stem from the decision. Now, enforcement is extraordinarily challenging
Yeah.
because ultimately international law remains the design of states. And the only entities capable of enforcing decisions of courts, whether it's the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice or any other international tribunal, the only entities capable of enforcing those decisions are states, either individually or collectively through things like the UN Security Council. And so when we're talking about Myanmar, the Security Council isn't going to do anything because China
Yeah.
and Russia. When we're talking about Sudan, Sudan also has degrees of protections. The government of Sudan at least has degrees of protection through other states, including Russia and China. Obviously, Israel has protections through the United States. Um, so it's very difficult to think how enforcement works because you're relying on, or how enforcement will work because you're relying on states that do not want to enforce these decisions. That being said, these decisions are forever
Yeah.
and they still matter, I think, for lots of different reasons, including by clarifying the law. And at least when it comes to genocide,
Yeah.
the obligations, again, are not just on the most powerful states, but indeed on all states. So again, Canada can do something about it. The Gambia can do something about it. All states around the world should be doing something about it. And I think that's important too. I think sometimes domestically states can be held accountable for violating international law. And these cases can be helpful for advocating for those types of cases to be brought forward or, to confront members of parliament or whatever it may be to say like, hey, what are you doing about this? This is what the court found. Um, etc. And of course, the hope is that eventually one day you do not have a fascist regime in the White House and you have a regime that cares about, uh, cares about, um, yeah, cares about human beings. And I don't say fascist lightly. I'm reading Timothy Snyder's work, and I'm convinced that these are proto-fascist types
Mhm.
that are increasingly in control of American of the American, yeah, of the White House. Um, yeah, so the hope is that there's change, and then these types of rulings and decisions will be impactful. And I can tell you, I guess, as a final point, that the International Court of Justice's rulings on genocide in various contexts have really mattered to victims and survivors, right?
Mm.
Because yeah, there's this enforcement bit, and it really does matter, obviously. But if you're a Palestinian or a Rohingya or, you know, one of my Sudanese colleagues or Darfuri colleagues that I work with, as you pointed out, people have been saying this is genocide for a long time. And when an international court tells you, yeah, I believe you, this is genocide, and here's why, that can really matter a lot.
It's validating, yeah.
Solve everything, but exactly, it can be very validating. And I think it's important not to forget that when we're talking only about enforcement.
What are some of the arguments you hear kind of most often? I think we talked about it a little bit, but that kind of push back against claims of genocide. Some are kind of linked to misinformation, disinfo. Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so again, there's a number of them. One is that it's war, not genocide, but again, we've dispelled that, right? That these things coincide and very often do. This idea that in some parts of a territory, the group's population may be growing, this is often put forward or is protected or has certain rights.
Mm.
Again, we have to remember that genocide is the destruction of a group in whole or in part. And the International Court of Justice has said very clearly that sometimes that can be a very small number of people, a very small number of people. So, for example, if you have, let's say, a group that has a small number of extremely important religious leaders, and and a state seeks to kill all of those religious leaders, but no one else. But if it seeks to destroy those religious leaders, in order to destroy the group in whole or in part, to have certain kind of impact on that group, that can be genocidal. It doesn't have to be, again, it doesn't have to be mass murder. It doesn't have to be mass graves. It doesn't have to be hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered. Indeed, it's unfortunate that, and this is true in Canada's criminal code, is that not all elements of the Genocide Convention are included in the way that we think about genocide. So, for example, Canada omitted the transfer of children from one group to the other in the criminal code. It just doesn't have it there. And we can imagine why that's the case, probably because it engaged in that type of behavior in relation to Indigenous children. But one of the ways in which I try to educate my students or talk to my students about genocide is not to overly emphasize killing.
Mhm.
Killing is just one of the five acts, and it's not always the one that is first and foremost,
Right.
right? So that's another thing, right? You'll hear, well, not everybody's dead, and some people are flourishing in this other part. Well, but that doesn't matter because it's destroying the group in whole or in part, and killing isn't the only way in which a group can be destroyed. There's another, I think, important and this misconception that I hear, and I just want to emphasize it, which is that sometimes people will say, look, we're not committing, there's no genocide here. We need these people to be moved. We just need these people to move off of their territory. Um, Again, and the motivation might be so that they're not bombed or so for their own safety or for their own protection. And I'm currently writing a paper on this, the relationship between forcible displacement and genocide. And it is an intimate relationship. And so when a particular group of people is told to move either repeatedly or regularly or in large numbers off of its territory, to me, that also kind of raises the alarm of genocide. You had the Armenians in the death marches. You have before the final solution in the Wannsee Conference and the Nazi genocide of and the Holocaust of Jewish people, the Nazis' preference was to simply ethnically cleanse
Yeah.
European territories of Jewish people by moving them to Russia or moving them to Madagascar. So you have all the genocide against the Rohingya is a genocide that has killing, has all of these other elements, but is also one of cleansing Myanmar of its Rohingya population by pushing people into Bangladesh, right? So you forcible displacement shouldn't be used, or displacement shouldn't be used as, hey, it's just displacement and can't be genocide. In fact, it is very, very often an indication that genocide is taking place, or that where the state fails to ethnically cleanse its territory, it will then turn to genocide as a kind of precursor to genocidal violence, if not in and of itself genocidal in that forcible displacement. So, yeah, those are some of the things that I hear quite a lot, and it's just I think it's worth dispelling some of those.
I mean, I saw somebody tweet a couple of months ago, there was a broken down building with a refrigerator kind of standing by and it had food in it, and therefore that was uh used as some bizarre argument in to say like, look, Gazans are not starving, they have refrigerators full of food, right? And it's like it's a lot of in itself kind of dehumanizing
Totally.
language that's there. I'm curious as a kind of final question, if you had a magic wand or, $1 billion, like what kind of particular reforms or mechanisms would you maybe put in place, or do you think need to happen uh, for this whole kind of process to be more seamless in terms of its maybe from the accusation stage to the evidence stage to the prosecution stage to the enforcement stage? Like, where do you see the gaps existing? And you have 30 seconds. No, I'm kidding.
I read a piece recently that by Marko Milanovic, who's a great international law scholar, and he said that we have entered a stage where when allegations of international crimes, including genocide, are put forward, the states against whom they're put forward don't respond in legal terms. They don't engage in legal argumentation. They tell you it didn't happen.
Right.
Okay, so we're being gaslit constantly. And in some ways, the battleground of investigations, prosecutions, accountability, and also the space which makes it sometimes harder to achieve those things and harder to establish the truth is social media and technology.
Hmm.
And I know you know this really well, right? The kind of evidence that ISIS put forward on YouTube,
Yeah.
and Canada's first war crimes prosecution in 10 years is going to highlight really the a video of a guy allegedly um murdering, not decapitating, but cutting off the limbs of a detainee. And so if I had, and we're doing this work with the Wayamo Foundation in relation to Sudan, if I could invest somewhere, it would be probably in bettering the tools and in growing the number of people who have the skill set to really sift through all of the video
Hmm.
evidence, all of the social media posts to verify, preserve, collected social open source evidence, and to do so then in a way where it's translated appropriately both into legal channels as evidence, but also to advocacy channels to push those states that are engaged in this type of violence uh, to at least acknowledge that what what is being presented, what people are seeing is real, that we're not just imagining this. Um, yeah, that's very hard to do, and there's lots of interesting people doing this work, but I think that's probably where I would invest the most. And then I would invest a lot of time into Canada and pushing Canada to do more. You know, like I said, there's nothing stopping Canada from considering an amendment to the criminal code, which includes cultural genocide, to take that seriously. There's nothing preventing it from sanctioning the entire cabinet of the Israeli government that's engaged in atrocities that the Canadian government itself acknowledges. Are atrocities in Gaza and in itself describes as intentional starvation. There's nothing preventing it from supporting the International Criminal Court with additional funding to investigate these crimes there and elsewhere. There's nothing preventing it from actually finally doing something about the armaments factories and military goods that are being sent via other states to places like Sudan. There's so much roadway that's still untraveled when it comes to what Canada can do, that if I had $1 billion, I'd probably hire you and and a couple of other really good people to put these cases forward to not just Canadian members of Parliament, but also to the Canadian citizenry about what's happening and how much more Canada can do. Because Canada isn't hugely influential, but it's influential enough that I think it could put a dent into the commission of some of these crimes. And again, as I said, we have so much that we have not done that we can still do.
And that kind of international reputation of Canada is still, I think, respected in some form. So that works in terms of influence also.
For sure. For sure. Yeah, we get, like on Myanmar, we have a lot of good credibility, right? And
Mhm.
then on Israel, Palestine, it's very mixed. But um, what I would say in all of my time at the yearly conference of the International Criminal Court and at the United Nations and talking to diplomats who are working on mass atrocity contexts at the UN and elsewhere is like, yeah, even when they're disappointed in Canada, they
Yeah.
want Canada back,
Right.
whatever that means to them, right? And we can debate whether Canada was ever like what going back actually means, but they there's a thirst or there's a desire for a more productive Canada on these contexts. So it's
Mhm.
not like people have given up, I would say, on Canada. They would very much welcome Canada back into the fold and doing more. And things like recognizing Palestine, I think, had some positive impact, and its work on Myanmar and the genocide against the Rohingya there, etc., had some very positive impact from certain sectors. And Canada's now, we'll see. Canada has now a renewed incentive to be better on this because it's running for a seat on the UN Human Rights Council. So we'll see. It's interesting times.
On that semi-hopeful note, thanks so much, Mark. That was excellent as always. Very informative, and you have a real way of kind of explaining some of this complex stuff to a general audience. So thanks so much for that.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everyone for listening.